Are you sure?
Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never ask a bride why she's getting married. Don't wear a skirt on a windy day. Deodorant is not a shower. Don't sniff chili flakes. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Time is going slowly again. An officer wrote in his diary 80 years ago this month, on the eve of the great battle that would tear the guts out of Nazi Germany. The days drag on endlessly, he wrote. There were no letters from his home and he worried an argument was brewing with his wife. I can be very tolerant, he reflected phlegmatically, because we'll soon be in battle and I'll forget everything. Then, just days after the famous landings on Normandy, the soldier disappeared from history. One of 8 billion Soviet soldiers who fell on the Eastern Front. European and American leaders gathered last week to mark the 80th anniversary of the Allied landings of 1944, when 150,000 soldiers from the United States, Britain, Canada, and France began the long, bloody march that would lead them to Berlin. This solemn commemoration of what's come to be known as the longest day is a useful prism to examine how power shapes and manipulates historical memory. There was a notable omission from the guest list in Normandy this year. President Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation were excluded from the commemoration because of the war in Ukraine. Instead, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky attended to illustrate, and I quote, how the landings resonate with the just struggle that the Ukrainian nation is waging today. Freedom is worth it, democracy is worth it, America is worth it, the world is worth it, US President Joseph Biden said in a speech valorizing the sacrifices of soldiers in both these wars. Liberal democratic values, though, didn't drive the soldiers who destroyed Nazi Germany. Even as Allied troops fought their way off the beaches in Normandy, 1.5 million Soviet troops had launched a massive assault on the Third Reich's Army Group Center, destroying 28 of its 34 divisions before they finally reached the gates of Berlin. German armed forces losses to war's end numbered 13,488,000 men, 75% of the mobilized forces and 46% of the 1939 male population of Germany, the historian David Glantz has computed. Of these, almost 9 million fell in the East. The stark inscription, "Died in the East," that is carved on countless thousands of headstones in scores of German cemeteries, bears mute witness to the carnage, Glantz records. The country which more than any other sacrificed to win the Second World War is now excluded from the public telling of its story, providing an education into how history is abused to serve the ends of politics. Formal ceremonies should be avoided, General Dwight Eisenhower ordered in a terse message to Allied troops in Europe on the first anniversary of the Normandy landings. Nazi Germany had surrendered a month earlier, but soldiers continued to fight and die in the Pacific Theater. A celebration obviously wasn't appropriate. 5 years passed before a formal celebration was organized, historian Kate Delaney has noted, involving a local bugle corps, 2 local girls who laid wreaths on the beaches, while bombers flew overhead firing rockets and dropping flowers. Even as this commemoration took place, though, the war in Korea had begun, pitting the leaders of the anti-Nazi alliance against each other. In 1952, Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe and a D-Day veteran, warned of the rise of, I quote, a new and even more fearful authoritarianism. We will gather the strength we have pledged to one another and set it before our people and our lands as a protective shield, Ridgway said, in words that clearly anticipated President Biden's speech. Even though the Irish-American journalist Cornelius Ryan's 1959 bestseller, The Longest Day, enshrined the Normandy landings in public memory, Major anniversaries of the operation did not draw American presidents, Delaney has observed. Lyndon Johnson, mired in the Vietnam War and racial conflicts at home, did not attend the 20th anniversary. Richard Nixon had started facing calls for his impeachment at the time of the 25th anniversary in 1969 and didn't go either. Timed to coincide with morning television in the US, however, the 40th anniversary of the Normandy landings provided a theatrical stage for President Ronald Reagan to showcase his Cold War vision. Soviet troops that came to the center of this continent did not leave when the peace came, Reagan said in a famous speech. They're still there, uninvited, unwanted, unyielding, almost 40 years after the war. We look for some sign from the Soviet Union, Reagan went on, that they're willing to move forward, that they share our desire and love for peace, and that they will give up the ways of conquest. The age of television transforms all things into kitsch. 4 years before Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan restored Normandy into the consciousness of the post-Cold War generation, that project had already begun on the news channels. In 1994, President Bill Clinton sailed across the English Channel in a faux flotilla, escorted by restored period aircraft. This reconstruction of the Normandy landing, staged for its 50th anniversary that year, was meant to signal that military force was a necessary instrument for protecting democracy and liberalism. "We are the children of your sacrifice," Clinton told veterans of the battle. "The flame of your youth became freedom's lamp, and we see its light reflected in your faces still, and in the faces of your children and grandchildren." 10 years later, in 2004, President George W. Bush went one bit better on the drama, ensuring the attendance of Germany's Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, together with the new Russia's Vladimir Putin. The Cold War had been won, and these figures could now come on board. Bush used the commemoration to signal that democracy was being secured across a new expanded West. But the new world still had to fight wars, whether against the jihadists of Al-Qaeda or totalitarian regimes like Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Saving Private Ryan's star Tom Hanks, together with Spielberg, mingled with the crowds and aging veterans. The gesture left little doubt that the film was intended as an answer to the ethical questions that had begun to swirl around Western hegemony and the global war on terror. And in 2014, at the 70th anniversary of the landings, Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel famously shook hands with Putin as they began secret diplomatic negotiations over Russia's invasion of the Donbass. The meetings would lead in 2017 to the Minsk agreements, which saw Russia and Ukraine agree to direct talks to end their conflict. From the failure of the Minsk agreement, French diplomat Marie de Wolin noted, Europe and the West learned that power and the balance of force did matter even in the post-Cold War world, just as it had mattered in the build-up to the Second World War. Ejecting Putin from Normandy is one way of building a public consensus around this learning. The idea that the sacrifices made in the Second World War saved humankind is true. Nazi Germany constituted a distilled, industrialized form of evil. Yet to pretend the war was fought to build democracy is a self-serving fiction. The Soviet Union dismantled German death camps, but also ran its own system of gulags that claimed millions of lives. The United States was an apartheid nation and remained one after the war despite the sacrifices of black American soldiers. Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill was an unrepentant defender of imperialism and an ardent racist. These truths, though, are not allowed to intrude on the invention of Normandy as a war for freedom. French intellectuals, in a letter demanding that Russia be excluded from last month's commemoration, noted that the country was not the only representative of the fallen soldiers of the Soviet Union. Large numbers of soldiers from Ukraine, they noted, had also died in the war against the Nazis on the Eastern Front. Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Georgian, Turkmen, Baltic, Belarusians all fought alongside Russians. 15 nations, after all, emerged from the Soviet Union's rubble. This was also true, though, in 2004 and 2019, when Putin had been invited to the commemoration, because then Russia was seen as a partner in the European geopolitical project. Ejecting Putin from this year's commemoration isn't only an act of protest against the in Ukraine. It is also an act of historical fiction writing built around the lie that the war on Nazi Germany was centered on replacing the tyranny with universal liberal values. Fiction writing isn't, of course, just a Western sin. The soldiers who fell in Kargil are hailed by politicians, but they show no similar interest in assigning responsibility for the many errors of military and political judgment that sent young men to their deaths. The war in Bangladesh continues to be assigned very different meanings by Hindu nationalists, Islamists, and secularists, each censoring important parts of the story. There has been no accounting either for the disastrous misjudgments that led India into the 1962 war with China. Like all rites of remembrance, Normandy seeks to tell a story that makes its audience feel good about itself. Nations that choose the comfort of the fairy tale ending over the often painful self-examination demanded by real history risk paying the inevitable price of self-delusion. I'm Praveen Swami, and I'm a contributing editor to ThePrint. Thank you for watching this episode of Security Code.